Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Holy Spirit Parish at the old St. Stan's Church. This is an important evening for the Environmental Justice Committee, which is a subcommittee of the Social Justice Committee at this parish. We've done a few things this semester. The Social Justice Committee, which, by the way, consists of our chairman, Susan Zock, and another member, Arlene Meyerhofer, who I gather might be out there because she's here. She'll be coming in momentarily. We read a very important book earlier this semester with a group of 15, 16 folks. And we're having a seedling. We're giving away seedlings coming up very soon to promote tree planting and carbon offset kind of a thing. So we're concerned about these topics, and we're very concerned about that topic, climate change. So's our Pope, written 2 documents on that subject. And so is much of the world as we try to figure out, we sort of know what's going on now and what to do about it. And so we're lucky tonight to have Jason Zinser here, who's a professor at UWSP in the philosophy department, where he teaches environmental philosophy and environmentally related subjects and other things as well. I first met Jason in January of 1995, which is, by my count, 30 years coming up, as we flew to Fiji in the South Pacific on the way to a semester abroad in Sydney, Australia. Great adventure. 10 days in Fiji, living with natives up in the mountain, no running water. Outhouses, take a bath in the river. And then Sydney for the semester, and then on the way home, 10 days in New Zealand. And it was all for a song. Today that trip is $25,000. But back then it was about 6 or 7. But it was a long time ago. And Jason was a group member. And he was a very good group member. I joked with his parents who are here from Warsaw. Jason's from Warsaw. I joked that I had some really good stories for them, but I really didn't. I really don't have any stories. He was an exemplary student on the trip, and even back then he clearly had a gift for knowledge, and that's what he does. He's all about knowledge. Let me read his formal introduction. Good to see your students do well, by the way. Jason grew up in Warsaw and also has graduated from UWSP. And he went to DC Everest, I was just told, for high school. One of his most impactful experiences at this university was a semester abroad in the South Pacific. He told me at lunch today that it was life-changing, and semesters abroad typically are. He went on to get a PhD in philosophy from Florida State University, Tallahassee, where he wrote his dissertation on the philosophy of biology, and that may be how he became interested in climate change. In 2015, he arrived back at UWSP as a faculty member. He teaches a variety of classes in the philosophy department, where he's tenured now, including environmental ethics and food ethics. We're delighted to have him here. This is being live streamed right now to anyone who wants to watch it. It'll be recorded and stored on our parish website. If you should want to watch it again, or if you want to recommend it, that would be great. So without further ado, I would like to present to you one of UWSP's own, Jason Zinser.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Thank you. All right. Thank you. Thanks for having me here tonight, and thanks to Bob and Susan for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here in Earth Week, right after Earth Day. I couldn't be here yesterday because there was a. Is it too loud? Yeah. There was an event at campus yesterday, and just as long as I'm talking about that, something kind of interesting to note is that the discipline of environmental ethics started at UWSP. The year after the first Earth Day, Professor Baird Callicott, who actually I had, colleague of Bob's, started teaching environmental philosophy. And as far as we know, it's the first time that this course was taught, and now it's taught at universities all over the world. So the start was right here at UWSP, which is kind of special. So I sat in on one of the book club discussions to kind of get an impression about what people were interested in, and how it relates to things that I'm interested in. And what I came up with is really kind of to try to diagnose what the problem is with climate change, why it's such a wicked problem, as some people describe it, and some possible ways to navigate that difficulty and trying to have an adequate response to it. So the talk tonight, I'm going to have like a little bit of a longer introduction to talk about some recent events, climate-related events, and then go into talking about why it's hard to get our minds really wrapped around the climate change problem, especially with concern about how to change our behaviors. And so that's where I'll kind of end up my talk. I'm going to raise some kind of problems, but I'm going to wait a little bit until the end to kind of address those problems. So just so you know where we're going with this talk. But sometimes, when you're giving a presentation or something, you might want to take a deep breath just to get calm before it starts. So if people can help me out, just take a deep breath. So what you're breathing now, the atmosphere, no humans in history have ever breathed this kind of atmosphere. So we're at, I just looked yesterday, we're at 427 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. The pre-industrial average was 280 parts per million. So this is something new to humans. And again, it doesn't feel any different, right? But the consequences, we'll talk about in a little bit. So my talk is called Moral Dimensions of Climate Change, and really I'm going to be focusing on the second part, which is living between denial and despair. So I think this talk gave me the opportunity to kind of put some thoughts down that I've had for a while and try to put them down in a way that makes sense, in a way to frame climate change. So we'll see if that works. And what I have there, if you look at the if you look at the background to the slide, it's kind of curious. This is actually done a piece of art or information that was created by a climate scientist named Ed Hawkins, and these are called climate stripes. Every stripe on that slide represents a year for the last 150 years. And the blue stripes are years that are below the 20th century average. And the red stripes are years that are above the 20th century average. So again, in trying to kind of get our minds wrapped around like what climate change is, this kind of visual representation kind of helps that a little bit. And you can see the stark going from the blues and the dark blues to the reds where we are today. Oops. Having trouble advancing the slide. Oh, there we go. Oh. Too fast. Oh, I'm going way the wrong way. Okay, sorry, getting used to the clicker. There we go. Okay, if you are under 38, you have never experienced a month where the average temperature was below the 20th century average for that month. Right. Unfortunately, I have. I'm not going to say how many months, but yeah. So the 20th century average for a month. If you're under 38, you haven't had a month of your life where you've experienced below the 20th century average. Do we know who that is? This is not the right crowd for that, probably. That's Taylor Swift. And the only reason I put her up there is because she's 34, and so she's probably the most famous 34-year-old on the planet. We have emitted the same amount of CO2 in the past 34 years as we have had in the previous 2 centuries of industrialization. So all the CO2, I mean, basically all the CO2 that humans have ever emitted throughout our existence has doubled in the last 34 years. So the problem is accelerating in some ways. March is the 10th straight month to be the hottest on record. So not only was 2023 the hottest year on record, but we're breaking records now every month. In fact, here's a tweet from climate scientist Michael Mann, who is noting here that the rise in temperature over the last year was so high that scientists are having a hard time trying to explain it. Kind of is higher than the averages, and part of that can be explained through El Nino, which is usually the weather patterns and ocean currents that yield higher temperatures. Part of it can be explained by rules that went into effect to have cleaner fuel for ocean ships to reduce particulates, which is good for the environment, but the bad thing is that it allows more solar radiation to enter our atmosphere. Right? A cleaner atmosphere, in some sense, at least in terms of particulates, allows more solar radiation in. But even with those 2 factors, we can't explain. There isn't a clear explanation about why there's been the dramatic rise in temperature over the last year. And again, just kind of pulling out, I talk about climate change just for a week in my environmental ethics class every semester. And it's pretty easy just to go in that week and find out, what are the climate-related events, weather events that are going on in the world? And here's just 2 this week that I pulled out. There was flooding in Dubai, where they received a year and a half's worth of rain in 5 hours. And then also heavy floods in China. And of course, look, floods have happened throughout history. Hurricanes have happened throughout history, droughts. But the idea is that climate change is just making all of those more frequent and more extreme. And it's getting so hot in some places, like India, where it is actually melting the asphalt. Right? And it's projected that by the year 2050, there'll be certain areas in the Middle East, I think maybe in India, in parts of Africa, where it's almost going to be too hot for people to survive, to live. Fires in, this is a little bit older, but the fires in California, I mean, just a few years ago, there were terrible fires in Australia. And we're lucky here. I mean, I'm showing you this in part because we don't oftentimes see the effects of climate change in central Wisconsin, right? We're sheltered. In fact, some people, this is an article from the New York Times that is talking about Wisconsin, particularly Duluth, is a kind of climate haven. So people are actually moving to places like Wisconsin, especially Duluth, because it is a place that is somewhat shielded from climate change. At least they think. But really we're not, right? We're all connected to other parts of the world in various ways. And if you're around here the last year, just 2 things that were shocking is one is, I think that I would get a lot of agreement here, and this is a pretty interesting winter. if we can even call it that. I mean, a little offended as a Wisconsinite to call that a winter, right? And in fact, maple syrup was 2 months early this year. Again, some things that I've never seen in my lifetime. And last summer, the smoke that was billowing through Wisconsin, again, something I've never experienced, and that was from obviously the wildfires in Canada. Again, climate-related, impacted by the climate. So not only is it impacting us, and I'll be primarily talking about the impacts to human beings, but clearly there's impacts to the natural world as well. And just to kind of talk about that, another kind of shocking statistic that when I saw this, it was kind of eye-opening in a way. What that diagram shows you is the mass of mammals in the world. If you take all the mammals together in the world, 96% of the mammals in the world are either humans or are domesticated animals. Right? So only 4% of mammals are wild animals, right? Wild mammals. And so, I mean, they're already obviously, stressed and threatened, and climate change just makes that much, much worse for the non-human environmental world. Right. One more thing, and then we'll get to the main part of it. So, if you look at climate change and you look at the impacts that humans are having on the world, there's been a recent conjecture, the last 10 years or so, that really, 10, 15 years, that has really gotten some steam. The idea that we've entered a new era of the world, a new geological era, called the Anthropocene. And you can see a number of books and magazines that are talking about it. They even have journals that are dedicated to the Anthropocene. And the idea of the Anthropocene, the Anthropos is human. So it's like we have entered the age of humans in kind of looking at all of Earth history, that humans are causing this new geological age. So it's a proposal for a new geological epoch defined by human activity. Officially, we're in the Holocene, and the proposal is that we've moved on beyond the Holocene to this human-dominated geological epoch. And the term has already caught on in the public and in the humanities. It's not going anywhere. People are still going to be talking about the Anthropocene, whether or not we are officially in by the geological standards. So you can see on the left, kind of, what we mean by this, or what is meant by this, is that geologists look at geological history. They look at different strata in the Earth to find out what was going on when and how to delineate time through Earth's history. And sometimes those transitions are marked by we know one, right? Thanks to Steven Spielberg, right? We know Jurassic Park, right? And we know that the Cretaceous era was ended by a meteor strike, most likely by a meteor strike killing all of the dinosaurs, right? And the idea is that this is an age that is also a transition to a new geological epoch, right? Where humans are now geological forces for the first time, right? And why, what causes, what are the impacts that we're having that are going to be marked in the geological record? Well, climate change is one, right? And what is meant by that is the rising sea levels, largely different changes to wildlife, right? So we are perhaps on the precipice of the 6th mass extinction. There have been 5 mass extinction events in the past, and there certainly is a claim now, a contention now, that we are kind of in the midst of a 6th great extinction event in Earth history. The human fossil record, that future geologists in 1,000 years or 1,000,000 years could possibly look back and see evidence for humans in terms of the things that we leave. Mainly things the buildings will all be gone, right? All of the infrastructure will be completely wiped out in geological time, but things like landfills might not be, right? And also nuclear isotopes So the one thing that will be evident in millions of years that might signify our being here is nuclear isotopes in rock formations. We've moved species around. We've also have, as you saw in the last slide, billions and billions of domesticated animals that will leave their fossil remains, or some of it will be fossilized. So they rejected it. This just happened just a few weeks ago, where they rejected the Anthropocene conjecture. I think it was a mistake, and I'll try to argue briefly why it was. So what I'm going to talk about, that was just kind of an introduction to get us thinking about what's going on with climate change and some recent events with climate change. So what I'm going to talk about is why it's such a hard problem to respond to. Why it's so hard for us to, again, to identify the problem and to respond to the problem in an adequate fashion. And I see this in part as a problem that is, there's a couple problems. One is denial, and the other is despair. And I think I'm going to try to articulate a few different senses of denial and a few different senses of despair, and argue that what we need to do is to find our path through those two ends, two poles. The right path is the path between denial and despair, which might be a narrow path. And then that leads to the how we should respond, the moral response to climate change. So, one reason it's hard to respond to certain kinds of problems is because we act rationally. And I teach philosophy, and rationality is, from the ancient Greeks, has been the hallmark of human beings, at least for Plato and Aristotle. So we think it's a good thing. And we think typically that it would lead us into making good choices. But the structure of some problems is such where actually being rational leads us to trouble. Right? And this is one of them. So this is a nice little example, I think. So imagine a scenario where you could purchase a $500 device that you could attach to your car, and that would remove all the CO2 from it, right, from your emissions. And then the question is, but you're not required to do it. And I have to add that you have $500 laying around. When I say that to students, they're always like, well, I don't have the money, so just assume you have the $500. The question then is, should you buy it? What is it rational to do? I mean, even if you are motivated by climate change and wanting to do something about it, what should you do? And the bizarre answer seems to be that you shouldn't buy it. And here's why. Imagine there's just a couple scenarios of the world. Either most people buy it or most people don't. And if most people buy the device, let's just assume, it will make the world a better place. It'll solve climate change. It'll be much better, right? If most people don't buy it, it won't, right? We'll live in a worse world, let's say. But now as an individual, right, individual contributions to climate change are really marginal. Right? They're not, whatever I do, I could drive a semi, towing another semi, every day of my life, and it's not going to really make an impact on climate change, a recognizable impact. I'm not going to harm anybody. And I think that's the case. Right? So now, given that scenario, if most people buy it, in that case, if I'm rational, I shouldn't buy it. Because the world's going to be good, and I get to have $500. Either way, I'm living in a clean world, if most people buy it. And it's just rational to say, well, I'd rather live in a clean world and have 500 extra bucks. Right? And likewise, if most don't buy it, well, then we're going to live in a dirty world. Right? And so the choice is live in a dirty world or live in a dirty world with $500 extra. And again, if you're rational, you're going to do the dirty world with $500 extra. So the problem is that by everyone acting rationally, it leads you to an overall bad result. Right? You think that rationality leads us to good results. The tragedy of the commons is where acting rationally leads you to a bad result. Right? Now, look, we can solve this. I mean, think about walleyes in Wisconsin. Right? Why do we have walleyes in Wisconsin, in lakes and interior lakes, inland lakes in Wisconsin? Because we regulate it. Right? You can only take 2 walleyes from this lake. The problem is with commons is there is no regulation, right? The atmosphere goes around the world, right? And there's nobody in control that can put down regulations on it in a multinational world. So here's an example at UWSP. That was at the old library, the new one's being built across the road, and you can see that little path there. Sometimes I think it's called an elephant path. I like to call it a lazy student path. But you see, I mean, this is an example of tragedy of the commons, right? If I walk across the grass, I'm not harming the grass. And plus, I save a second by cutting the corner there. It's not a problem until I do it, and you do it, and you do it, and everyone, most people do it. Then the problem. So individual rational actions lead to an overall bad result. Now, that result isn't too bad, right? But there are lots of cases where it's quite bad. We also our psychology is not built to be able to identify these kinds of problems, right? Our psychology is such where we can easily, we're built to dodge baseballs, and we're built to interact with other people. We're not built to respond to atmospheric chemistry. And another, we're not built to be able to really untangle the causal connections between our actions and the effects. Right? So I'm driving around, I'm, going to work, I'm drinking my coffee, I'm watching TV, what are the energy impacts of that? What are the, where's my food coming from? Right? What's that involved? What are the impacts of the way that I eat or the way that I live? That's separated from me. And it's hard for us to conceptualize that in ways, right? And there are political obstacles as well, right? I mean, the top image, our economies are built around cheap fossil fuels, and they've been built up over the last century and a half or 200 years around cheap fossil fuels. And so it's really kind of, difficult to unwind that in a rapid way. And then the bottom picture is an image that separates what's called the global north from the global south. It's kind of a crude designation, but the idea is that the global north are the developed countries and the countries that have, the developed countries, the developed world, and the red part are developing countries. Now, I think China could be, China's a special case now. But the concern is that, the global north, Europe and North America, again, have benefited from 200 years of exploiting, cheap fossil fuels and built up their economies. Now the global south would like to do the same, right? The problem is that if the global south develops in the same way that the global north did, the same way that Europe and North America did, it would be, catastrophic for the environment. Right. Okay. So just some kind of, again, problems about why it's so hard to respond. And so where does that lead us? I'm going to talk about a couple of forms of denial and a couple of forms of despair. And then, because you might want to say, I'm going to respond to them. So just don't worry that I'm not advocating for these. I'm pointing to them, and then I'll be talking about the response to them in a little bit. But one form of denial is just, right, the obvious one is denying climate change science, right? So just denying the ideas that, there's a lot of disputes within climate science. But I think what isn't under dispute is, from climate scientists, is the ultimate cause of that, climate is warming, and the ultimate cause of that warming is human activity. Right? But there's another kind of denial as well, and that's denying the severity of climate change. So, and by the way, these aren't like, equally bad or anything. They're not, it doesn't, because I'm showing different kinds of denial, doesn't mean that they carry equal weight in this argument or something like that. But this is a kind of denial that perhaps applies to me and to people who are concerned about climate change. In other words, that our actions aren't appropriate for the problem, right? That we just, it doesn't rise up in our awareness enough to act in ways that would address the problem adequately, right? I mean, and one way to think about this is to go back to the tragedy of the commons. And I talked to a lot of people who are very concerned about climate change. But the idea is that, well, my actions are meaningless in the grand scheme of things, so I'm going to continue to live my life however I live my life, even though, in some vague way, I'm concerned about the climate, right? So this is a kind of denial that might apply to people who are very concerned about the climate, actually, right? And then there's two forms of despair, and one is doomism. And so this is, you see, this is a form of like, almost like what's called eco-anxiety. There's actually a psychological term for it now, where, and I see this at the university, where students are, there's a kind of, I think it's pretty well known, there's a kind of mental health crisis for young people these days. And what does it cause from? Probably lots of things, right? I'm not an expert in this. But part of it might be kind of concern about the environment and about mainly the future environment. And so doomism is the idea that it's too late to respond adequately and that apocalyptic scenarios are inevitable. And if we could just get the video here. This is, by the way, I'm going to be clear about this. This is a fictional depiction of what doomism looks like.
So there won't be any hard questions. I'm just going to ask you to expand on the report. Pretend you're an expert witness, and I'm your lawyer.
Sounds good.
With a growing consensus among
Standby
environmental
camera
experts
one.
that the 450 parts per million will soon be crossed, the question remains, how will we respond?
And joining us now in studio is Richard Westbrook, Deputy Assistant Administrator of the EPA. Welcome.
Thank you.
Mr. Westbrook, you've spent most of your professional career as a climate scientist in the public sector.
Yes, 10 years as a supervisory management analyst in the Office of Environmental Information. And before that, I was a program specialist in the EPA's Resource Management Division.
And you have a PhD in climate science from Stanford.
Yes, and another in chemistry with a master's in biology.
Okay. Tell us about the findings in the report that was just released.
The latest measurements taken at Mauna Loa in Hawaii indicate a CO2 level of 400 parts per million.
Just so we know what we're talking about, if you were a doctor and we were the patient, what's your prognosis? 1,000 years, 2,000 years?
A person has already been born who will die due to catastrophic failure of the planet.
What did he just say?
Okay, can you expand on that?
Sure. The last time there was this much CO2 in the air, the oceans were 80 feet higher than they are now. Two things you should know. Half the world's population lives within 120 miles of an ocean.
And the other?
Humans can't breathe underwater.
You're saying the situation's dire.
Not exactly. Your house is burning to the ground, the situation's dire. Your house has already burned to the ground. Situation's over.
So what can we do to reverse this?
Well, there's a lot we could do.
Good.
For 20 years ago or even 10 years ago, but now, no.
Can you make an analogy that might help us understand?
Sure. It's as if you're sitting in your car, in your garage, with the engine running and the door closed, and you've slipped into unconsciousness, and that's it.
What if someone comes and opens the door?
You're already dead.
What if the person got there in time?
You'd be saved.
Okay. So now what's the CO2 equivalent of the getting there on time?
Shutting off the car 20 years ago.
You sound like you're saying it's hopeless.
Yeah.
Is that the administration's position or yours?
There isn't a position on this any more than there's a position on the temperature at which water boils.
The administration, your administration.
And don't forget, I need you to
supports wind and
stretch
solar,
40.
clean coal, nuclear power, raising fuel economy standards, and building a more efficient electrical grid.
Yes,
And?
that would have been great.
Let's see if we can't find a better spin. People are starting their weekends. The report says we can release 565 more gigatons of CO2 without the effects being
It
calamitous.
says we can only release 565 gigatons.
So what if we only release 564?
Well, then we would have a reasonable shot at some form of dystopian post-apocalyptic life. But the carbon dioxide in the oil that we've already leased is 2,795 gigatons. So,
What would all this look like?
well, mass migrations, food and water shortages, spread of deadly disease, endless wildfires, way too many to keep under control, and storms that have the power to level cities, blacken out the sky, and create permanent darkness.
Are you going to get in trouble for saying this publicly?
Who cares?
Mr. Westbrook, we want to inform people, but we don't want to alarm them. Can you give us a reason to be optimistic?
Well, that's the thing, Will. Americans are optimistic by nature. And if we face this problem head on, if we listen to our best scientists and act decisively and passionately, I still don't see any way we can survive.
Okay. Richard Westbrook, Deputy Assistant Administrator of the EPA. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Can't go? Do this to
Thank
clear
you.
out stuck poop fast. On June 17th,
Thanks. Yeah, that's the best example of doomism I can find. But there are lots of other examples that you can see people making, predictions that it's just really too late to. And this is true. I think it is. Climate change isn't something that can be solved. But I'll respond to doomism in just a second. Doomist position. Okay. So just like, sorry. So just like, here's another kind of going along with doomism. There might be a kind of a psychological draw to this. So here's a kind of interesting quote from a Japanese novelist. Everyone deep in their hearts is waiting for the end of the world to come. So if you look at, apocalyptic proclamations, right? History is littered with apocalyptic proclamations. And so I think we should be wary about our current apocalyptic prognostications as well. The other kind of despair, so when despair is like it's too late, the other despair is that is a form of eco-fascism. And this can happen, I think from the political left or the political right. You can have, here on the left there's a sticker that says Corona is the cure, humans are the disease, right? So kind of eco-fascism is where you hold ecological goods above human beings. Edward Abbey, a famous kind of a writer and thinker in the West, is a great example of this. He said at one point he'd rather shoot a human than a rattlesnake, right? That's an extreme kind of eco-fascist claim. But on the other side too, you have people like Mark Zuckerberg, that's the news article on the right, who's building a $100 million kind of climate bunker to protect him in Hawaii. So you have this kind of reactionary attitude towards, climate change. Right. So between Scylla and Charybdis, this is from Greek mythology, where Odysseus was coming home on his voyage, and he had to avoid in his ship these two disasters, right? These two dangers, Scylla and Charybdis, six-headed monster in a whirlpool or something like that. And so the way I'm conceiving this is that we have to find a way between denial and despair, right? That's going to be the path to addressing this kind of problem. So let's see what that might look like. So in terms of, I talked about the tragedy of the commons and that it's a collective action problem. The standard way that people respond to Tragedy of the commons cases, again, is through like enacting laws. The problem with climate change is that there are no laws that can cover the whole globe, right? So it is a really true tragedy of the commons case. But that doesn't mean that individuals don't have moral responsibility as well. And I think I saw some people a little bit upset when I was describing the tragedy of the commons cases. And you might be thinking, that's not how I think. And I think that's right. In some sense, I think it's a good thing that we don't act rationally in those kinds of cases. Right? And here's one kind of response that one can give to the tragedy of the commons case, and that's with integrity, that we act on integrity. And a person of integrity who has this commitment will act also on a personal level to reduce her own emissions and will, in general, avoid frivolous emissions of greenhouse gases. Her actions at the political level will be integrated with those at the personal level. So it doesn't make any sense, according to this position, to kind of fight for legislation that addresses climate change and then not kind of participate that in your own personal lives, right? Integrity would mean that you would have to be consistent in that. Denying denial. So to address kind of the science denialism, it's just that there isn't really a scientific controversy about the general nature of climate change. There's great unanimity among climate change in the broad structure, in that it's happening and it's caused by humans. There's a lot of disagreement about all the details about the mode and tempo of how it's happening. This is a harder one to respond to. So denying the severity of climate change, how to get people that accept the science to respond appropriately to the threat. But if you look at, for example, public polling about like what concerns you, climate change never rises very high in those polls, right? We're more concerned about immediate pressures, and maybe rightfully so. It's hard, again, for our psychology to capture that. But we need to find ways to try to get people who are who are concerned about climate change, to get them to respond adequately, right? So in other words, we might not just focus on, I think a lot of attention has been focused on science denialism, right? But I'm saying that some more focus needs to be on people who accept the science, but don't accept the severity of it, or it doesn't register in their lives in the right sort of way. And finally, so responding to the despair, so responding to the doomism, climate change cannot be solved, but we can make the future meaningfully less worse. So if you look at most climate scientists are not going to be like the fictional account that I showed you, right? That are going to argue that it's too late. Katharine Hayhoe, I think, is a great example of someone who a leading climate scientist who is not into doomism, right? In fact, I think argues pretty clearly and forcefully against doomism. And responding to ecofascism, the best response, and the one that is morally required, is to respond globally to help the global south develop. Right. So this is much more we could say about this, but climate change is not just an environmental problem; it's a human problem as well. And so, environmental problems and other kinds of human problems necessarily can't be separated. So we have to foster a sense of hope. The majority of climate scientists are not apocalyptic. And again, we can't solve it, but every improvement we can make, every 1/10 of a degree that we can reduce from future climate change will save perhaps millions of lives and species. So while, certainly the die is cast that climate change is happening and is going to happen throughout our lifetimes, and things will get worse in that respect, they can either get less worse or more worse. Right, and we have some control over that. We have the technology and knowledge to meaningfully respond to climate change, but so far we have lacked the will. This is actually important, right? We can imagine problems that we can't solve or we don't know how to solve. This is a problem that we do know how to solve, right? We just lack the political will to do so. So that's kind of good news. And we can find new ways of thriving in an altered world, right? So hope is kind of the antidote to despair. And so even with the changing climate, even with the, kind of problematic environmental things that are happening, there are lots of ways to be hopeful about the future. Yeah, I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. In just a second, I'm almost done. And what else can we do, right? I mean, I don't know about you, but doomism just seems like a non-option to me. Like that's not a choice. We have to try to do as well as we can for the future, for children and grandchildren, and so on. Right? And in fact, like as I was kind of finishing up my lecture this week, or my talk this week, I think I saw this on Thursday. Well, I don't know. It was yesterday, the day before, where the New York Times had an article, and this was the first time I've seen this phrase, and it seems like a contradiction, but apocalyptic optimism. And that's kind of what I'm trying to advocate for, this idea that, well, and again, that seems, I don't know, I'm not sure I'm happy with that phrase, but the idea that, yes, climate change is happening, but there are lots of amazing things that people are doing to try to respond to it. I see this in my students all the time. The energy and the focus, the passion that they bring, the innovative ideas that they're thinking of. And by the way, I'll just throw this out there too, because that article referenced this series. So if you're looking for kind of optimistic future technologies and ways that people are trying to address it, this is a PBS series. I haven't seen it. But I bet it's really good. A brief history of the future, and I think you can find it online as well. So, and so I'll just finish up by revisiting the Anthropocene argument. I argue, and this is something I wrote a paper about it, that I argue that the Anthropocene should start in 1990s. That, in other words, we entered a new geological age, I want to say in the 1990s. And the reason I want to say that is because I think it's the first time in Earth history that a species is knowingly changing the environment, or knowingly has the capacity to change the environment. Right? Species have changed the environment throughout history in various ways. Right? The oxygenation event, why we have oxygen on Earth, that was through biological species, so on and so forth. But this is the first time where a species is, in some sense, intentionally changing the geological record. Right? So, whether or not these, what kind of changes are we going to make to the environment, to the geological record? I mean, who knows, right? Who knows who knows how we're going to end up responding to climate change? But I'll tell you this, that in 1,000 years or 10,000 years, or 1,000,000 years, what the geology will look like from this time period does depend on how we react, right? Either we make drastic changes to it or we don't. But either way, it's our choice. And I think that is significant enough to say that we're in a new geological epoch. So some people who argued against the Anthropocene say, well, we don't know what the future is going to be like. We don't know what the geological record is going to be like in 1,000,000 years, right? Or what people in 1,000,000 years, when they look back, what they're going to see. Fair enough, I agree, right? The future is not set in stone, but I want to add to that, we have become Earth's masons, right? That we are now responsible. And what that means is that gives us agency and power to respond, right? I agree that the worst case scenarios are not, certainly not guaranteed to happen. But whatever does happen, it is within our will, it's within our power. So I want to argue that we are now in the age of human beings. And with that, I'll take some questions. Thank you.
Very good, Jason. Very thought-provoking, very informational, challenging as well. So I think you've covered the main basis, so thank you very much. We now have time for questions from the audience. So we'll go back here to this gentleman who looks familiar.
from your point in academia, what role has the religious community in this country played, and what role could it play?
I'm of the persuasion that it can play a very important role. I think someone who talks about this is E.O. Wilson. He's an entomologist. Bob and I talked about E.O. Wilson. He's a controversial biologist, but he's very much, he passed away a few years ago, but he was very much concerned about, biodiversity is one of his kind of concepts and champions. And what he argued is that the social solidarity of religion is kind of required in order to kind of marshal the response to climate change. So this isn't that's not a kind of an area of expertise that I have, but I think the bonds and the social cohesion that is tied to religion is hard to find elsewhere in society. And I think that is at the very least, a really valuable tool to be able to address these kinds of problems. And that's not even to start talking about the Laudito Si and the kind of religious-minded or Christian-minded kind of sense of stewardship over taking care of God's creation, right? I think those are arguments that can be made as well. So I think it can play a very important role in responding to climate change.
I should also add that this is Earth Week, and yesterday was Earth Day, which Wisconsin, figures prominently in this because one of our senators, Gaylord Nelson, was the founder of Earth Day, and then it grew into Earth Week. Maybe it'll be Earth Month someday. But I think it's appropriate that we wanted to do this with Jason this week because of it being Earth Week. Questions?
Would there be any relationship between, say, the anti-vaxxers and people that don't believe there's any climate change? Would they tend to be the same people? Or would one particular party, Democrat or Republican, be more likely to be anti?
Yeah, well, good. Thank you for that. So what I tried to do in talking about it in terms of denial and despair, it's going to affects both sides of the political spectrum, right? There's different kinds of denial from both sides. There's different kinds of despair on both sides. Whether or not the importance of the different sides, and that's a different kind of argument. So I'm not saying that they're equally problematic, let's say. But yeah, I think there is some work that says that there are connections between, like, science denialism, in various forms of science denialism that are kind of lumped together, and also kind of relatedly, conspiracy theories too. Is that typically someone who is motivated for conspiracy theories isn't just motivated for one. It's usually they oftentimes are susceptible to many different kinds of conspiracy theories. So I do think that I'm not as worried about those who deny climate change, in part because it's hard to persuade them in various ways, different attempts, but also because I think if those who are persuaded of climate change, if they can act appropriately and with the right level of seriousness, that the problem can be addressed. So my thought is to not worry as much about the science denialists as to focus more on the severity denialists.
What role do businesses play, or business in general, when we look back at all those blue countries on the top, for 500 years, the greed to acquire has driven us from colonialism to capitalism to this concept of freedom that, I can, especially in the United States, I'm free. Don't tell me what to do.
Yeah.
Don't tell me I have to buy this car or buy that car, or that I need to participate in this common effort to solve this problem. That's not my problem. So, but behind that, there seems to be this overarching, drive for profitability.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of challenging issues in what you said. I mean, it brings up a lot of really serious challenges. But part of that, the blue state. I mean, look at the standards of living. It's pretty amazing. The GDP, the life expectancy. So there's been a lot of benefits, and I know there's been drawbacks as well. Something else I just want to mention with this is what corporations oftentimes, there's a political angle to this, and again, I'm not a political scientist, but corporations want us to think that it's up to us to stop climate change, right? And so they want to put the burden on individuals. And if people want to drive, very fuel inefficient cars, or people want to consume a lot or whatever, then, well, corporations are just doing what they want. So they're kind of, they want to put the burden on individuals and not on themselves. And very famously, oil companies have known about climate change science for decades, since the 1950s, but have tried to hide it. I mean, similar to like tobacco companies. The same kind of playbook is being used. And they want it, they want to try to place the burden on individuals. And so, Naomi Oreskes is really someone who has written pretty extensively about that kind of dimension of climate change. So corporations are certainly, have a responsibility here. And something kind of related to that too is that, they've gotten wise to this, right? So they oftentimes want to present themselves as being a very environmentally kind of concerned company. But oftentimes, there's a phrase for that called greenwashing, that they think that they are, they present the image of an environmentally responsible company, but it's just a veneer, right? It gives and it gets you to feel more comfortable with buying their products. So they're actually just making us feel more comfortable and have less guilt with our consumption, right? So those are significant contributors and significant problems to try to address. Yeah.
Do you think that the denial and skepticism about climate change, some of it may not be age-related? I mean, my observation is that so many of the students seem to be involved. So as our generations pass on, that the new generations are going to be more amenable to these changes.
I would say so. Yeah, I mean, it strikes me as that's the case. And also, not only, it might be a generational thing, but now there's smoke in our summers in Wisconsin, or at least last year, right? So now, for so long, I told students, and this was a common thing, I think that lots of, and I heard it, I didn't invent this, but, climate change is a problem that, you don't have to worry about it, I don't have to worry about it, maybe my kids or grandkids have to worry about it, right? And that was what was striking about that, one thing that struck me about that little video, it's about 10 years old now, and they said that, he said that the first person that will die from climate-related changes has already been born. I think it's indisputable that the first person who died of climate change-related issues happened 10 years ago, or it's already happening. And so when you see the extreme temperatures and weather events that are more woven into the fabric of everyday life, it's harder to deny, and I think especially for younger people. So hopefully I didn't intend this to be more of a scary talk, but hopefully ending on an optimistic note. And there are lots of wonderful things happening, and especially driven by younger people. Yeah, Leo.
Jason, you in the choice between individual and collective, you answered both.
Yes.
And the importance of integrity. Likewise, for assessing the severity, we might think of quantity or quality.
Yeah.
What can philosophy offer to help us integrate these disparate terms? Quality, quantity, individual, collective. My brain seems to be wired for either or thinking, and you're asking us to do both and.
Yeah, and not only is it there are gradations, but like I don't have an answer to how I or you or anyone else should live, or what counts as an adequate response to climate change. I didn't make that clear because I don't know what that is. And that might differ from person to person. So, I mean, I do it in I suggest kind of modest ways. So, like, it's not that. I'll get myself in really hot water now. I didn't mention it, one of the great contributors to climate change is agriculture, is food production. And probably the worst thing for climate change, for CO2 emissions, is meat, right, is industrial agriculture. So I talk about this in class clearly, right? My food ethics class, I talk about this. But what I try to stay away from is to say, like, one shouldn't eat meat. That's a whole different kind of argument. So what I think is a much better strategy, and there are lots of ways that people could respond to that. So a much better strategy, just and pragmatic grounds, is to say we should reduce meat consumption, right? And that might mean something different to me than to you. But if we both reduce our meat consumption, whatever that might mean, that's a contribution, right? So there are structural ways that we can structure the world. Sometimes they're called nudges, where the world is structured in a way where it's just a lot easier to make better choices, right? So, for example, electric vehicles. If there are more charging stations, if there are more incentives to buy them, just more people are going to do it. So we can nudge people in the right direction without even having them to change anything in their minds. We could just structure the world in ways that helps to make climate change. But yeah, I'd have to think a little bit more about how to quantify better in that sense.
Are we up? Bob, wait a second, Bob.
You made a statement about areas in India and Africa that might become inhabitable soonly.
What's that?
Those areas, what's your projection? Is there a projection for when people won't be able to live in certain parts of the world?
I mean, David Wallace Wells, a kind of an author in this area, he's really a journalist. But from the research that he's looked at, he threw out the date 2050, kind of a rough date. It's just going to be too hot to be able to be outside for very long. So yeah, there are certain places where it's probably going to be uninhabitable and certainly in my child's lifetime.
What about
the Louvre?
What about Duluth is the question?
Oh, Duluth, yeah. Well, we are lucky. I mean, this is part of the reason it's difficult for us is because we are lucky in terms of climate change. There's a lot of good reasons that Wisconsin is more sheltered, right? More sheltered, not totally. But one thing I worry about is, the worst wildfire in history that killed the most people, I should say, in history, happened in Wisconsin. I don't think it's on people's radar now, but I'm concerned that in the not too distant future, we could have, California-style wildfires in Wisconsin. I'm not the right person to talk to about that, but that's what, and the last thing, what really keeps, I mean, these things worry me during the day. What really keeps me up at night is that climate change will cause, or other reasons, will cause political dysfunctions globally that will make it such that we just can't marshal an adequate global response, and which would lead to worst case scenarios. So that, I mean, things we can't calculate for is what are politics going to look like in 10 or 20 or 50 years, not only in the United States, but globally. And those were some really kind of really, really scary risks involved there.
Time for one more question. Sue?
Jason, thanks. You're working with college students all the time, and Joe brought up the question of the difference in generations, but I think our young people are at risk of feeling hopeless.
Yeah.
And they are looking to us. So do you see that in your classes? Does it come out where students, maybe the students taking your environmental ethics class are already convinced that we better roll up our sleeves and do something together, but I mean, you mentioned 2050, and I probably won't be here, but certainly my children will be, and our children and grandchildren, and the indigenous peoples who have this, you live as if 7 generations out, that you don't, that you're providing for the future generations, and it really seems like we need to come together, and I think that's the morality of this issue, that something can still be done, and we need to join hands and give our youth some, I mean, I think of Greta Thunberg too, and
What's that?
Greta Thunberg.
Oh, yeah,
who inspired so many people at the, was it the Paris Climate Conference, so yeah, I think they're really looking for hope from us.
Right, yeah, and I think, I mean, I at UWSP obviously is a very famous natural resources school, so, and that's why we have a lot of students coming in through environmental ethics, because it's a requirement for many of the students in natural resources. And they're there to do kind of, you know, things like ecological restorations and to work for natural resource government organizations. So they're out there doing the work, and they're very active. I see, way too active for me in that respect. I couldn't do those things anymore, but they do. And so, but I think you're exactly right. That, and that was one of the things I was trying to, to point out, is that is hope, and to avoid that despair. And I think there is good reason to avoid despair, to have that apocalyptic optimism, that the changes, there are ways that we can make the world meaningfully better, and we have to work, roll up our sleeves, as you said, and get to work on those. And I think that they, by and large, are I'm excited to see what they do.
Thank you very much, Jason.
Thank you.
Excellent job. One other thing that the Environmental Justice Committee has done is that we're putting a solar panel on St. Stan's School. We've raised the funds. We are in the process. We also put in a more efficient furnace, LED lights, and the students are going to see those panels on the top of St. Stan's. We couldn't do them here because this is too steep. But we've been working on this, the Environmental Justice Committee, with other parishioners, and Susan has carried the ball on that. So we're also doing that. And I know it's not a lot, but it's something. And we think that the benefits, it'll pay for itself eventually, of course, but the other benefits are to the students, because we are concerned, young people, this is the main parish in town for young people, and we want them to see that, and we want them to learn from that moral statement of having those panels and our commitment to solar energy. And solar energy is growing very, very rapidly. Let me finally say that I'm always concerned as a sociologist about the term wired. Wired. Our brains are wired. We read a book this semester, as I mentioned, and some of the participants are in the audience. Joe and Brian, and of course Susan was there, Arlene. And this book was by a biologist, Catherine Hayhoe. It's called Saving Us. And she thinks that we solve the climate, or we address the climate problem by talking more and more to people and sharing what we have in common. And that's a simplistic way to summarize her point. But she mentions in the book, like Jason did, that we're wired to think of our own rationality. We're wired to take that shortcut through the library, or we're wired to abuse the commons because it benefits us. But as I read history, as I read social history, we thought we were wired to obviously have slavery. There are some human beings who are clearly inferior. Clearly, I mean, it's obvious as the nose on your face. And so they deserve, or they are fit for slavery. Now, maybe in the long run we can lift them up. But slavery is just, it's in the Bible, there were slaves, there were chattels. And so it may be part of God's plan to have slavery. Well, we outlawed slavery in this country. Britain outlawed it way before we did, 30, 40 years before we did. And we wouldn't think about it today. I mean, I know there still is slavery in the world. But that so-called wiring to think of the hierarchy of human beings, the obviousness of it, no more. Child labor 100 years ago. Well, families need the money. Children, there are no public schools 100 years ago, 125 years ago. So those kids should go to work. And it's just as obvious as the nose on your face that we should have child labor. Kind of wired to have child labor. We outlawed child labor finally in the 1930s, although some reductions began in certain states in the progressive era, 1900 to 1917. So certain states did it. But finally, in the Roosevelt administration of the 30s, we passed Social Security, we passed 8-hour day laws, we passed unionization laws, and we made the work week 40 hours, and we outlawed child labor. And we added minimum wage. Another part of our wiring was that there's always going to be a hierarchy of economics, and this is still very strong in the U.S. And we're kind of wired to think that God made the world, that there would always be rich and the poor. Doesn't the Bible say the poor will always be with you? Maybe the Bible means poor of spirit. But the Scandinavians have done a great job eliminating the lower class, virtually eliminating it. There are still some bums, and there are still some people who prefer to sleep rough and so forth. But they have virtually done away with the lower class. Because as you know, they have a system of very high taxes and a wide distribution. They're having some problems right now with refugees, and there is racism in Scandinavian countries. But their gap between the top and our gap between the top and the bottom, the U.S. has the greatest gap between the top and the bottom of any rich country. Just to illustrate. Scandinavians are like this. How do they do that? Have they rewired their brains somehow? No, social policy. And they've kept the same government in power pretty much since World War II. It's deeply cultural. It's part of their culture. They have the word enough. Everyone should be satisfied with enough. You shouldn't be trying to accrue more and having more and climbing more. That's seen as very immature. Is it a different wiring of the brain? Well, I guess so. I guess so. It's a more humanistic wiring of the brain. So I'm very, very suspicious, and not a criticism of you, Jason, but the idea of human nature comes into this. It's human nature to want more. It's human nature to consume more. It's human nature to want to be superior to your neighbors. No, it's not. Those are all cultural, those are all learned behaviors, because there's plenty of examples where that doesn't happen. So I'm more hopeful based upon how I read history. That's what I wanted to end the evening on. And now Susan wants to make a presentation to our guest speaker.
On behalf of Holy Spirit Parish and our environmental committee, we're so grateful that you've done this and prepared and come tonight. And this is a membership in the Aldo Leopold Foundation, and it includes a visit to Aldo Leopold's shack for your family and you. And it's the 75th anniversary of the San County Almanac that many of us read back in the 70s. And I saw this statement that comes from the book, and I just thought I'd read it. It's very pertinent to tonight. And that land is a community is the basic concept of ecology. But that land is to be loved and respected is an extension of ethics. Thank you so much, Jason, for coming.
Thank you all for coming. I'm so glad Jason did such a great job, because his relatives are right here, his parents. Parents are come down from Wausau, and a sister came over from De Pere. And so congratulations, Jason. Thanks a whole lot. Good night, all.